Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Kirby Lambert, and I'm with the education program here at the Historical Society. And we are very pleased today to have with us Lesley Gilmore, who is the author of this new book. And she's going to be telling us some about it this afternoon. And I'm sure as soon as the talk is over, you're going to want to run to our store, where they would be more than happy to sell you a copy. And you can find out the rest of the story. Lesley M. Gilmore is a licensed architect who has been director of CTA's Historic Preservation Services since 2006. In that capacity, she has worked on the preservation of historic properties in Yellowstone National Park and other national parks around the country. She became more immersed in the study of modern architecture when engaged by the General Services Administration to evaluate several of its modern federal courthouses. Her recent work on the renovation of Canyon Village Lodge has given her the opportunity to delve deeply into the lives of those working for the National Park Service, the Yellowstone Park Company, and the architecture firm of Welton, Beckett and Associates when the seminal Mission 66 project was planned in 1955. Lesley and her husband Bob Franzen live in the Gallatin Gateway, Montana, 1.5 hour drive from Yellowstone National Park. And Lesley also is a frequent contributor to and participant in our annual Montana History Conference. So some of you may be familiar with her work there, as well as her work in architectural preservation. So it's my honor to introduce Lesley.
Thank you, Kirby. I remember to turn it on. Does that work? Yes. Awesome. Great. I could think of so many things to say in response to all that, but I actually gave a presentation, I don't know what year, for the Montana History Conference about modernism and how we pretty much love to hate it. And tried to, I think I even did a survey in the audience to try and get people to vote on various buildings that I showed them on the screen. Because my premise is that the more you understand something, the more you will appreciate it. I don't know if that actually works for everyone, but I think it's still worth a shot, because I think that, you know, we really have to understand something in order to be able to make a good determination on it. Right. Or I could just do that probably too. Nope, guess not. Okay. Right, so this is the book. You know, people, if you start talking about something, people will come up to you and say, oh, you should write a book about that. And if you haven't done it in the past, you have no idea that, oh, it's actually, even though it's a tiny little book, it's going to be a lot of effort. But it was a great chance to really delve even further into this Canyon Village in Yellowstone. I'm going to get back to my notes so that I don't forget to tell you some really important things. But it's been a real pleasure to work on this project and the book and do research in this very building and work closely with Lori Morrow to get photographs from the Haynes collection. And as well to share this with you, because I've really become quite enamored with the modernistic period and also the buildings in the park. And as with any project like this, nothing is done in isolation. I'm at CTA, and they were kind enough to give me some time to work on the project. So they're a definite supporter, as well as all these other individuals and organizations, because there's a lot of places one goes to do research. And I don't think, I did include the Getty research. I got to go to LA. Oh, what fun that was. And to go to the Getty Research Institute and UCLA, because Welton, Beckett and Associates was primarily a Los Angeles firm, and really a high-powered firm in the mid-50s. And so it's really pretty exciting that they came to Canyon to design this project here. Mary Murphy is the one that got me into this in the first place by helping engage CTA to do what's called a historic structure report for Canyon Village. And that was all part of a memorandum of agreement, because the park was going to be tearing down a lot of the cabins, most of the cabins, and building hotels that some of you have stayed in. I've already heard about that. They enacted this memorandum of agreement, which enabled me to be able to talk about the unloved. But luckily, we've got all these Haynes photographs. And I think the colors and the slides of these buildings really bring it home and make you realize, oh, these were really beautiful buildings and they were vibrant, and it was a really pretty exciting time for this new construction within the park. And yes, many of these buildings really aren't liked. I'll admit that I never really even noticed this building the first time I went to Canyon Village. I remember seeing it and just kind of wondering, oh, I wonder what that is. I mean, the building is huge. It's 320 feet long. You can't miss it, but you also wonder, what is it? You know, and what is it for? And that was one of the challenges we had during the design for the renovation. But it doesn't look like the Old Faithful Inn. It doesn't look like Old Faithful Lodge, does not look like the prior Canyon Village Lodge or Canyon Village or Canyon Hotel. So there is a bit of an adjustment for even people today to go to the parks and try and enjoy this architecture. I like looking at the colors, though, and it's the color of the cars that match the building and vice versa. You know, this was a national theme in terms of colors. But this is all part of Mission 66. And when actually I gave a talk similar to this in Livingston, and I asked how many people had heard of Mission 66, you would think in Livingston, just north of the park, that everyone would raise their hand. Most people didn't know what Mission 66 was, even though a lot of them lived through it. And maybe you had to live in the park to really understand it and to see these signs on a regular basis. But Mission 66 was a national program, and it was all about fixing the parks. And there were 180 park units at the time. I think I've been told that there are 411 park units now. So that talks about national parks, national landmarks, and national monuments. And so there are quite a few of these in our park system now. This program lasted from 1956 to 1966, so it would be completed for the 50th anniversary of the National Park Service and return the parks back to a better condition after having been neglected for a fair amount of time between the war years and the Depression. And even though during the Depression there was the CCC program, that was mostly for state parks. There were still some improvements in the national parks, but by the time 1955 came along, the parks were in such disrepair, and roads and infrastructure had a lot of needs. Now, there had been plans in the 1930s, master plans for a lot of these parks. However, due to the Depression and funding difficulties, they were not enacted. So in the 50s, they resurrected these plans from the 1930s. That was their really good starting point for figuring out what to do in the parks. They had about 50 million visitors throughout those 180 parks in 1955. They were anticipating that they would have 80 million in 1966. So they were beyond bringing the parks up to the current standards. They were also looking at having greater populations. And you'll see that Yellowstone, oh, maybe I will have to use the green thing. All right. This is the total travel, the number of people. You can see it was really low in 1932. And this is it climbing, and it dipped again in 44 war years, and then climbed really steadily, really quickly with returning GIs and people having more leisure time. And this is where they were in, so 55, 56, Yellowstone did a prospectus to say, look, we anticipate having this many people by the time 1970 comes along. They anticipated having about 1.7 million visitors in Yellowstone alone. And we're way beyond that now, but this was 1970, and they had less than 1.3 in 1953, and now, so they were looking at huge increases. And this was and that would, beyond needing more buildings and good roads, they would need more manpower as well. So that was one of the other arms of this program. And this is Yellowstone, and 98.5% of the visitors were coming in their own vehicles. We think it's bad now. This is 1955, 56. So I know cars are a little bigger maybe, but, it was really, really problematic at the time. So the roads were heavily, heavily used. They really needed to improve them. They needed to build more campgrounds. They were looking at trying to accommodate any range of visitors who would stay in hotels, motels, who had less money, wanted to camp, or just have that type of experience. So they're looking at a broad range of visitors. What the Park Service anticipated was that the government would spend about 55 million over this 10-year period, and that the private sector would spend about 15 million. This is, again, that's throughout all the park units. So I've mentioned Conrad Worth. He's in the red circle. That's my attempt to avoid having to use the pointer. But this is in 1956. It's February 1956. He and the Secretary of the Interior went and spoke with President Eisenhower, who had actually made some promises that he might try and provide more money for the national parks. Well, they convinced him totally. I mean, Worth had been working. He was the director of the National Park Service. He had worked with the Park Service since 1931 in a lower capacity under Albright and a lot of Mather men, and worked his way up. So he's the director in 1954, and I think he was the director in 51 through 1964. He made a lot of changes in the structure of the Park Service and made his mission, and it was a mission for him, to improve the parks all across the country. So this is a celebration with the Automobile Association, because of course they're thrilled that we're going to be improving the parks. This is like the day after Eisenhower approved a huge funding influx for the parks in 1950, for the 1957 year. And I think, let's see, he approved a 1957 fiscal year budget of $12.5 million. The prior year, it had been $4.4 million. I know this doesn't sound like a whole lot of money, and they had been putting a lot more money into the parks before then, but that it had plummeted to something as low as $4.4 million for across the whole 180 units was really phenomenal. So having the $12.5 million as a starting point was great. And as I said, the whole goal was to spend about 1.3, I mean, they ultimately spent about 1.33 billion, the government themselves. So it was a private and government venture. So, but this is a great celebration because, of course, obviously the Automobile Association would be thrilled to have more people being able to drive to the parks and have greater access there. But Worth really had to sell this program, and what it was kind of a three-pronged approach. It was about disregarding precedent, starting anew. It was about conserving the natural resources. So they put out a lot of booklets and did a lot of newspaper articles, a lot of TV interviews, radio ads. Worth had to get the word out there to get support so that you and I as citizens would also make sure that our legislators supported it in the budget votes that would come in future years. But his mission, as he said, disregard precedent, the lid is off. Wow, what does an architect do with that? But also be imaginative in considering all problems and bring up something different in achieving the twin objectives of protection of the resource and optimum use, because all of us are going into the parks. He was really interesting in the way he approached this, because he wanted to hear from the rangers and the other park personnel, and he opened up comments. He would go and provide information at the parks and ask for feedback from everyone, from the janitor to the superintendent. So he really was trying to get a broad spectrum of ideas, because the people who are working in the parks know them the best and would be able to provide the best guidance. So he's essentially opening the door, though, to modernism, and we'll see a bit more about that. Why did he choose Yellowstone? All the parks, if they wanted to have this infusion early on in the first few years of Mission 66, needed to submit prospectuses about what they would do with the money, what the need is, and what they would do with the money, their plan. They had to have like a 10-year plan. And Worth was really interested, even though he had them submitting these prospectuses. He was talking to the Yellowstone superintendent back in 1953, 54, and talking with the Yellowstone Park Company, the major concessionaire there, as early as that as well. He was really trying to set the stage and get it going early on. And I'm sure he might have picked another park, but the fact that it was also the first national park. He had a lot of reasons to start with Yellowstone, as well as the fact that the Park Service 20-year contract with both the Yellowstone Park Company and Hamilton Stores, another large concessionaire in the park, both of those contracts were set to expire at the end of 1955. The timing was perfect. He could negotiate new contracts to essentially force them to spend a lot of money, because we needed the private capital to be able to encourage them to spend money on these new developments in the park. So the Grand Canyon, which is like the second most visited feature in the park, taller falls than Niagara even. I mean, it's an incredible, incredible feature. This was the focus. And what he ended up doing was convincing the Yellowstone Park Company to sign a contract to agree to spend $3.5 million in their first 10 years. So from 1956 to 1966, you'll see later that they spent far more than that within the first 2 years. They had hoped, meanwhile, to only be spending about $335,000 a year. And if things had kind of gone along as they had in the past, just maintenance and maybe some upgrades, maybe some work on Canyon Hotel, but they were convinced by the Park Service that they could enter into this larger agreement, a larger project. But this was the first time they ever had to go for a loan. They went to banks who said, look, you're going to have to prove that there's going to be some profit from this, and not just on the good years. You have to give us the pillow counts. How much money is this going to make? Is it actually going to be a money-making venture? Both Yellowstone Park Company and Hamilton Stores were very concerned about whether they would make enough money to pay for the improvements they were being asked to make. They did get their loan finally in, I told you it was December of 55 that their contract was set to expire. They'd been working on a new contract for about a year. There were a number of hiccups. Ultimately, though, they did get the contract signed in February 1956. They got their loan agreed upon, I think it was March 31st, 1956, and they started construction of the cabins April 1956. They had already hired the architect back in October 1955. There was a lot of early work in preparation for this, and finally the contract came through and they were able to move forward. I realize I can't talk about this without Billy Nichols, Harry Child, Huntley Child Jr., Billy's son, John Q. These were all people that actually had a very strong tie-hold to Helena, and were the Yellowstone Park Company. Were it not for them and their fortitude, taking that loan out, moving forward with this, and agreeing to proceed with this project, if it were not for them, this project, this Canyon Village, would never have happened, despite the fact that Conrad Worth said, I'll find another concessionaire. I mean, he really did threaten them that he would find someone else. Frankly, I don't know who he would have found, but they did move forward with it. Obviously, as I said, they got the loan. And because, Harry Child, whom I'm sure all of you know about, he had already passed away as early as 1931. So his hand was not in this at all. It's his son-in-law, Billy Nichols, and his nephew, Huntley Child Jr., and then ultimately Billy's son as well. So one of the other reasons that Canyon was selected, because I said this was a conservation program as well. They were trying to get properties and development away from the natural resources. So, and I apologize because, it's not my fault, but the canyon goes west, it goes south, and so I'm trying to provide direction here on where you are, but so that's why I do have a couple things that indicate where things are, because we have the phenomenal Yellow Falls, we have the Grand Canyon Hotel, and that was first originally, they had tent hotels there as early as 1881 or 83, and then the west wing of this was actually built in 1891. They added on to it in 1911. This is a Robert Reamer building, absolutely lovely. I try not to focus on it too much because it's very near and dear to a lot of people's hearts. They really remember this building very well. The Grand Canyon Lodge, which was where essentially what was where a lot of the entertainment occurred as well. You've heard about the sagebrushers and the the dudes and all that type of stuff where the employees entertained the visitors. And the deal was, though, not that the Grand Canyon Hotel was too close. There was what they had, what was called a sacred zone, and it was originally in 1883 when they had an act to define the sacred zone. It was a quarter mile away from any resource, any geyser or the falls. And in 1935, they actually shrunk that to 1/8 of a mile, which is really, really close to a natural resource. The Grand Canyon Lodge and the ranger station and the photo shop, they were all at this kind of pinch point really close to the falls. So that was part of the idea. Do this new canyon village up here, away from the falls. See, this is where I was talking about the falls. Well, they kind of go west and they go south, and so. But we have all these old locations of where, and this is a great map because it's 1957. It's at the crossroads between the old development and the new that it is being developed up here. And this is what we'll focus on here. These are loops for the cabins. Oh, as it says. And Walton Beckett. Sorry, his photo is so much larger than that of John Nichols. It was just a better resolution because one of the great things about working on buildings that are a little more recent is that Walton Beckett's son, two sons, Walton Jr., his son Bruce, and his nephew McDonald, who actually ended up running the firm after Walton died, they're all alive and well and living and happy to provide information and whatever memories they have. Granted, they were pretty young. They're in their 80s now, so that still makes them quite young in 1955. They weren't necessarily directly involved in the building, but they provided access to a lot of information and photographs as well. Isn't he a handsome man? He was born in 1902, so the interesting thing is that Conrad Worth, he was born in 1899. Walton Beckett was born in 1902, and Frank Matson, a name you'll hear soon, he was born in 1901. They're all in their mid-50s, at the prime of their careers when this is going on. Thank God, because this was a really hard and difficult project. They put their all into it, and so we were really lucky that we had 3 movers and shakers that were really working hard on this project and making it happen. He actually is a very interesting man because he had, Walton, had very large project experience working on hotels in Egypt, Cairo and LA as well, but he also was personal friends with Dwight David Eisenhower. One of his key players in his firm from like 1953 to 63 was a man named James Beardwood, who had helped get Eisenhower nominated and elected for president. He was on his campaign. So there was a strong tie there with Eisenhower and Walton Beckett. But he had done a lot of work in LA. I love to show this because research is more than just sitting in a dark room. You can, but now we have great archives, access to newspapers, and to what his personal life might have been like. Apparently, he was so upset by Bogart's dogs barking that he went over there to complain, to help his neighbor complain. And I love it. He talks about how Mrs. Bogart, Lauren Bacall, said, "Just don't eat them if the dogs are annoying you that much, But he died quite young, unfortunately. He died at age 67. He was FAIA at that point, and he had a large, long, illustrious career. But he died in 1969 at age 67, so really quite young. But it was said in one of the firm brochures, but they had these regular brochures that were printed for the firm as well as for their clients. It said in his obituary in the firm profile, he loved work, he loved play, he loved life. His was a rich life, a full life, a meaningful life. But look at what he did. 1935, his first firm, actually second firm, but the first firm he was part ownership in was with a man named Werdman. They called him Walton Welt, and they designed the 1935 Pan Pacific Auditorium. Unfortunately, this building is no longer here, but this really helped put him on the map, particularly in terms of Hollywood personalities. So when Werdman died as early as 1949. Then Walton Beckett went on to have his own firm. He was always at the head of it, so his eponymous firm. It grew into a very large, strong firm that was well-renowned. And as I said, he was indoctrinated into the fellows of AIA in 1951. He designed Capitol Records. This is the same year that they were working on Canyon Village. And you can see here this is the binding, because this is one of these wonderful hardcover advertising books about what Welton Beckett and Associates did. Flipping through these, it was just fascinating to see the type of work they did, the long list of incredible clients: Ford Motor Company, General Petroleum Company, Lever Brothers, Anaconda Wire and Cable. They actually designed the Hart and Albin store in Billings, excuse me. So they did a little bit of work in Snow Country. They designed a lot of large department stores. And as I said, they also did large hotels and large shopping centers. I think Stonestown, I've gotten ahead of myself, was 1949. Yes, they had 48 stores there, 2,500 cars. So you can start to see the pieces come together. What a great firm to design something like Canyon Village, which will have a lot of buildings, a lot of parking. It will have restaurants. It will have essentially hotels and stores, granted of a very different nature, but all those pieces come together at Canyon Village. So they were very well suited. Now, the interesting thing is that you'll see here they've got parking on the outside. Here are the buildings, and then a walking mall in here. And Canyon Village is pretty much the opposite of that. You have all the buildings on the outside with the parking in the middle. That's so that when you park here, you can see the visitor center first, ideally. And all your services are all around that wonderful horseshoe, dormitories, and nature around the outside of that. So it's an exact reversal of that urban shopping mall. This had about 360 parking spaces, so it doesn't compare to that 2,500 at Stone Ridge, but you do get an idea that really that's really new and different and large for our park here. And this is the 1930s 1956 master plan that shows you what the intent was. Again, so there's that parking we were just looking at. This is the big lodge. They show all those glue lamp beams hitting the ground here. These are the dorms we were just looking at. Store. This is the Hamilton store. The photo shop for Haynes Photoshop, and the visitor center. Now, and then cabins loops A and C. B was never constructed until like 1969. That was not part of the original project. But the Park Service was doing the infrastructure. So I said the park spent money and the concessionaire spent money. So the Park Service spent money developing the site, the parking, and all the site that the cabins would go on, all the utilities, and the campground, and as well as the visitor center. But everything else, this was all Welton Beckett and Associates. And they were looking for, you can see these are pretty sizable loops. They were looking to build originally 300 cabins, or 300 cabin units, and they would be as many as 8 in one cabin set. So you'd have 8 units within one, and a cafeteria for 250 people, a dining room for 250 people, a lunch counter for 65. So they were looking at a lot of different types of accommodations, similar to what they're doing today. But you start to see these great renderings that Welton Beckett put together, what their impression of these Park Service buildings should be. Welton Beckett started in October 1955, as I said, because Yellowstone Park Company knew they had to get going. If they were to actually start construction in May 1956, so they could open in 1957, the Park Service was really keen that they have a successful early project. Open in 1957. That's why they were kind of looking for what we call shovel-ready projects. So they wanted to have as much ready as possible. Now this is where Frank Matson comes into play. He was Yellowstone's landscape architect and had been there for at least 5 or 6 years at this point. And he had kind of grown up in the Park Service system as well, because when he graduated with a degree in landscape architecture in the early 30s, there were not many jobs in the private sector. So he was able to get work at the Park Service. And he went, like a lot of the Park Service people, he went and worked at a number of different parks. He worked in Yosemite, he worked in the Tetons, and he worked in Yellowstone a couple different summers, and then ultimately had a full-time job there. Now, so this is the first rendition of what Welton Beckett thought they would have. This is the Canyon Village Lodge as you know it, pretty much, right? Although you start seeing indications here of a standing seam metal roof, and we'll have some comments from Frank on that. This was the registration building with a long dormitory wing here that's 2 stories tall. This is what's called the recreation hall. This is where the dudes and the sagebrushers would perform for the dudes. This was meant to be a public building. And then you see the parking lot here. Frank Matson said, "The proportion of the roof, which is one continuous plane and exposed to view, is somewhat of a shock. The park visitor will also gain a first impression, and that is the one they will take with them. In direct elevation, 80% of the main is roof." He didn't really care for that much roof. He also didn't like the fact that it was shown as sheet metal, didn't think that that really fit in with the more rustic nature of the park. He also felt, and you'll probably agree with this, I think we still have a problem with it today, that the entry should be more obvious. Where do you enter in here? But here, this gets very California exciting. Reflecting pool. Frank didn't even comment on this. There are no comments anywhere in all the records, and I think it's just because he dismissed it outright. What can we possibly do with having a reflecting pool here? But there's this wonderful pergola connection to the registration building. And this is where you see more detail about that standing seam roof. But generally, the massing of the building, very much what it ultimately became, and the construction in terms of these glue-lam beams going all the way down to thrust blocks at the bottom. But Matson had a real field day with the rec hall. There would have been 1,000 movable seats, and it would provide performances by the savages. Sorry, I was saying sagebrushers, I meant savages. Similar to the entertainment that they used to have at the old Canyon Lodge. But Frank's comment here was, "Those of us who have worked in parks for some period may become obsessed with the idea we wish to see structures subordinated to the terrain. Therefore, a building which does appear more or less completely stable has greater appeal than one which does not. Do others also see the broken back and the poise for flight, which has already been expressed?" This was just far too dramatic for him. And mind you, this building was never built, but it was more for funding purposes. But this is also at a time when Conrad Worth is rejecting a Frank Lloyd Wright design in Yosemite. He thought it was far too progressive. And actually, I haven't seen that design. That would be a good research project there. It was soon after that you get to see more expressive buildings like this within the parks, like you see at St. Mary Visitor Center and Logan Pass and Glacier. I think we just needed a few years to be able to expand and get a little bolder with a modern expression. This was just a little too early, I think, in the process of the whole program. But this is what the interior would look like. Very simple. It's not like architects just started designing modern buildings in 1955. They had been working in this vein for a fair number of years at this point. So Welton Beckett was quite adept at making something look like a ski lodge, taking advantage of these incredible soaring volumes you can get from 92-foot-long glue lamps. This is all, some of it's new construction. I mean, in terms of materials, the glue lamps, they'd finally, in 1942, gotten the glues to work well enough, but it wasn't really, we had a bit of war effort in there. So it was the 1950s. You start seeing the glue lamps in a lot of school buildings and a lot of other buildings where we need a wide span. Look at this free wide span, and look at these, I did the wrong direction, right? Look at these crazy little, tiny little wood-carved columns. They went by the wayside. They were a $5,000 saving by not using them, apparently. But it's unlike steel, it's very warm. So the notion of using glue lamps, and they're strong, they're fire resistant, and we have a 27-foot tall volume here. I mean, it's an incredible volume, very like a ski lodge, it seems to me. And a fireplace, you can see, in a large amount of plate glass. So these are, that along with the simplicity and the nature of the materials and the honest expression of the structure is all a part of what they're expressing here. And that's the advantage of getting to work with, I think it was It was Bruce Beckett who sent me these images and then latched me onto AECOM, the current firm that owns essentially the history of Welton Beckett, to be able to get permission from AECOM to be able to use these images. And this is from the original construction documents, giving you a great idea of what that volume looks like. The parking lot is over here. These were the thrust blocks I was referencing. That wonderful walkway that takes you to the registration building is right through here. Look at all that glass. And look at this. This is wood mounted on a diagonal. It's really treated like a fireplace. Very simple, obviously, but that's what its role and function is in terms of the hearth of the building and making it somewhat warm and welcoming. And I liken this area, which is mostly was originally the service area, employee rooms, laundry. I liken that to a bank barn because you come out here, you know, it's a day-lit basement, essentially. You come out here to the loading docking area, and it is essentially built very much like a bank barn in that sense. And this is my favorite. I told Patty earlier, I just want to go, you know, mosey up to the bar and have a drink. This bar did not, unfortunately, did not last long. However, this beautiful Moreau-like mural here is actually black lit, and there was a beautiful. Isn't this crazy wild? This big, really just kind of guttural almost stone wall. They're really trying to just deal really well with some materials that you are accustomed to seeing in the park. And you would normally expect to see a big, massive stone foundation. And so this is their way of still bringing in natural materials, and used plywood on the face here. Plywood was a really popular product in the 1950s and 60s. They'd worked out all the glues and worked out great veneers, and it's a nice, clean, really beautiful wood, warm feeling. And this bar was originally shown on the drawings as a straight rectangle. It was in January 1957, a newer version of the drawing showed it as almost like a question mark shape, which is really elegant and sophisticated. In our discussions with the Wyoming SHPO, someone said, oh, so is this building kind of like the Jetsons? And like, no, this is more Mad Men. So those of you who have seen Mad Men know that it's more cosmopolitan and sophisticated than the craziness of the Jetsons. But you do get something like this. So we have a very neutral background. You have the great wood, and you can see that nice warmth of the wood ceiling, the wood glue lamps, and then, wow, this is the north wall of the dining room with these, what we call line art drawings. They're like 1x4 wood slats that were painted. I asked all three Becketts if they thought, so what was the idea here? Was this, is this trying to be Native American? Is it supposed to be symbolic? Welton Beckett did a lot of murals, exterior and interior, all over the place. And so they had interior designers who were quite adept at putting things together. I think this was just their idea of, what Native American art might or might not be. But you look at the colors against that really dark background, and that's where the glitz came in with providing color in isolated spots so that you really noticed it, just like on these wonderful light fixtures. So the decoration was fairly spare. The Independent Record, newspapers everywhere, particularly within Montana and Wyoming, were talking about this groundbreaking that was going to happen. And on the left, you see that actually it's a later version of what we saw from October '56 with the parking lot and the rec hall still there, and the Yellowstone Park development planned to cope with vast multitudes of visitors. They ultimately had the groundbreaking on June 24th, 1956. Conrad Worth was there. The Secretary of the Interior was there. A lot of bigwigs. And Conrad Worth spoke about the inaugural aspects of this project. This occasion will remain forever as one of the truly great and memorable moments of my lifetime. For here today, as we break ground for the new Canyon Village, I can actually feel and see that mission, capitalized, he always capitalized mission, 66, is at last underway. the National Park Service has entered a new era which promises to be the most rewarding in its history. And motels were also advertised as well. And it wasn't just the local places that were advertising. It was really interesting to see when you do a newspaper search that in the early, 56, 57, the whole country, Arkansas, they're all running ads about this project. A few years later, yes, they're running ads about the project in their state. And so it got more internally focused there. Architectural Record ran a long article about Mission 66 and what it meant architecturally. So there was a lot of interest in this. And here we are at the groundbreaking. I love to circle Conrad Worth's head, apparently. But now he is joined here. I showed you that photo of Billy Nichols. Well, he was older by the time this project was taking place. So they're all at the groundbreaking. They have their shovels. This is Billy Nichols. And actually, they tell you right up here. Oh, and actually, that's right. It started the 24th, which was a Friday. They had dinner at the Canyon Hotel and drinks there. And then they came out to the site Saturday morning at 10 a.m. with Charles Hamilton, the old rascal, and Jack Ellis Haynes of the Haynes Photo Shop. Now, Hamilton and Billy would not be around for the dedication a year later. They both passed away before that could happen. But this is representative of the three main concessionaires that had run this park for years. Yellowstone Park Company had started in 1891, and they had bought various other companies and consolidated their companies with the help of Hugh Galusha Jr. here in Helena. And actually, Hamilton stores used Galusha as well for accounting. And but so they were all working in this park for a long time. Hamilton started here in 1915. You probably know that Jack Ellis Haynes' father started in the park as early as 1883. He was what helped make this park famous. A lot of the photographs that were disseminated and that we use today from 1957 slides were from Haynes as well. So these three were in every major park site within Yellowstone. And so, of course, they would all be represented here in Canyon. And they all had monetary investments and interests in this as well. And this is the image of the motels, which were the linchpin, really. 2 days after that groundbreaking I showed you, McNeil Construction, large contractor who actually built Disney World out there in LA, realized that they had a shortfall in the budget, that instead of the project costing $3 million, it would cost $4.5 million. To occur 2 days after the groundbreaking was really a shock and a very huge disappointment for everyone. So they rallied around it and figured out that the Yellowstone Park Company particularly would focus on the projects, the parts of the project that would be income generating. So instead of 300 cabins, let's do 512 cabin units. Let's put off the construction of the recreation hall. Let's take away that extension, that two-story extension to the administration building. So it's a much smaller footprint. That what I showed you was about 10,000 square feet. It now has, I think, 2,600 square feet. So a good fifth the size of what had been attended. They needed to be able to reduce spending on property that would not bring in money. So they focused on the cabins. And as I said, the contract was signed in February, the loan in March. April 1st, they started making these cabin parts in in Gardner. And it was all prefabricated. It's interesting that Walton Beckett is doing this prefabricated here. He ended up doing a fair amount of prefabrication later on for some Disney hotel in Florida. That was, I think, 10 years later. But, prefabrication really was something that came out of the war years as well. How can we speed up construction, have smarter construction? And this was a way, certainly, to get the cabins on site much more quickly. And I don't know how many of you know Herb Dawson, who used to work at the SHPO's office here, is now in the park. He was at a garage sale in Livingston and came across rolls of drawings for the cabins that the Park Service didn't have any longer. So he loaned them to me. We scanned them. It's been a great find because it showed, and this is the Type C cabin, which were a little friendlier in that they had these splayed walls as opposed to being the Type A, which just was like 8 units in a row, just, kind of very rectangular and rigid. There was just a little more artistry to the Type C here. And they had all these great details about how many different panel sizes there were based on regular old 2x4s, 4x8 plywood that was 3/8 of an inch thick, and minor bits of insulation as well. And this is that Type C cabin during almost around completion. You can see how muddy this site is. This was not an easy site to work with, for starters. The contractor, they tried to start in May of 1957. They actually it was like May 25th, so they started later installing these cabins on site and getting construction of the Canyon Village Lodge and the registration building going. But then they had to stop early in November because, of course, winter came, and they couldn't start early enough again. And so the contractor is under the same restraints that our contractors face there now. Gosh, how early can I get back in so that I can still complete it by the same completion date that my owner is mandating that I complete it by? How do you squeeze all that stuff in? And how do you work with a nasty site that the Park Service hadn't really enough time or manpower to prepare properly? So there were complaints about these cabins from day one, although some part of it, there's a lot of blame to go around. And there were lawsuits, and I don't go into any of that. But some of these cabin parts, which did have insulation in them, were stored somewhere where all the insulation got wet, and they went and installed them. So they had problems that they had to work out for a number of years after the original construction. But you can see that there's this great little bit of color coding at the door and around the windows so that you'd be able to find your way around because they all looked alike, right? Yeah. The cabin's rates, this is 1966. But even in 1957, they were $10 a room, a person, and that was the same you paid at Old Faithful Inn. So isn't that interesting? It was considered, comparable overnight accommodations. So I mentioned Hamilton as well, and that store building is not dissimilar to the Canyon Lodge, although and it used the same kind of glue lamps, very similar type of glazing, although not as much glazing. It didn't send the glue lamps down to the ground, but I love this photo because it shows you turquoise matches the car, and it's just like the orangey color on the Canyon Village Lodge matches the orange cars of the time. But they actually shared a couple of drawing sheets of the same details. So they were really trying to have a consistent architectural theme. But then you get Bill Grabo, local guy. There he was in Bozeman designing for Haynes, as they say, picture shop here. He had worked for Fred Wilson. We all know Fred, right? Love and know Fred Wilson, an architect in the Bozeman area from like 1906. I think he passed away in 1956. No, sorry. Anyway, he was not, so it must have been 53. He passed his firm on to Bill Grabo, who also worked with a man named Ozzie Berg. And Berg was the one who designed the brick breed and field house, that beautiful glue lamp structure there. All these architects were really trying to expand what you could do with the materials available. So Bill Grabo essentially was the inheritor of Fred Wilson's firm and was working on Haynes Photoshops. And at Tower, at the same time that he worked on this one, this building didn't actually open until 1960, so they had a shop temporarily in the Canyon Village Lodge until this building opened. And Canyon Ranger Station, which is the visitor center designed by Hurt and Trudell out of San Francisco, who I figure Trudell must have known Worth in D.C. because he worked for the National Park Service for a 5-year period during which Conrad Worth was there. And the visitor center this was, a new typology for the parks, and some parks treated them differently than others as despite the fact that the Park Service was really trying to develop a continuity between all the parks. But this one did not provide interpretation inside the building. It really didn't have the room to do that. Some visitor centers did. Instead, what this visitor center did was it provided you with information in the 200-seat auditorium and then sent you on your way with information about the resources, like the canyon, that were available to you. But it also was supposed to be the most dominant building in the development, and I beg to differ that that actually occurred with this development. Of course, it depends on which way you enter that parking lot as well. And this is and I'll apologize, I refer to it with two names, the registration building or the administration building. Essentially, if you're coming to stay in a cabin, you register here. There was also a nurse here, and as I said, if it had been built in its original vein, it would have had a long extension to the right there. But you can see this lovely pergola that's extending to the lodge itself. And the exterior is really where the colors were very muted, but they were allowed to, and these have since been painted, We had to fight to get some orange back at Canyon Village Lodge. But, so, I mean, it's really a very muted or restricted use of color on the exteriors. The records show a lot of conversation going back and forth between the Park Service, the landscape architect Matson, and Welton Beckett about what the colors should be. No one could agree, and so it's kind of fortunate that we had some exterior color for a while there, but it really didn't. It didn't last long. But you start to see people appreciating that color more when you go to St. Mary. You can see the great color that they have up there at their visitor center, and no reflecting pool. What a pity. Oh, and this is looking through that pergola towards the visitor center. So now I'm just going to focus a little bit on Canyon Village Lodge because that's a building that we've gotten to know even more intimately, being able to do the renovation of it. So this is what it looked like in 2017. Yeah, luckily they have put some more signage up, and they put up some Mission 66 interpretive signage to help give people an idea of its context. But this building had seen a lot of modifications early on. So it was completed, opened in August 1957. As early as 1960, they moved the bar because they needed more room for the dining room. And they converted rooms on the lower level from employee residential to a conference center. They had thought that they could get conferences down there, and they did get a few. They removed the laundry so that they could have more room for that as well. So there were a lot of changes, and those spaces have since been changed as well. But fortunately, we do have the original construction drawings, and we've got these great photographs that show how it did feel and what it was like in 1957. And we have these beautiful translucent screens that I think were a really great device to be able to define spaces and provide some privacy. This is where the bar was. See that little bit of that rough rock wall, and the bar was over here. And of course, beautiful fireplace here. And this is where the gift shop was. When we came along, I think that's where the next slide is. That wall here is gone because they'd expanded the dining room into here. This wall was here, but all filled in with solid plywood panels, and this is really sad that they had to do this. So this is like 8'3", this is about 10'6". They had to put this extra panel up here because people were getting over the wall and into the gift shop. So when we came along to redesign that, we wanted something lighter weight, but they still had to have that protection. But the whole idea was that you could have these spaces within this larger volume and still read that beautiful larger volume. That was the whole idea. And this is what we have now. Let me go back, because according to Jim McCaleb, who worked for Xanterra for years, in 1985, they carpeted the entire park. And they also painted, you can see this is pale now. There's the light fixtures don't have that great color. It's hard to see it here. But we also have, this is what they carpeted over, an end grain wood block floor, 2 inches thick. this is what they used to put in post offices because it's so durable. And it's beautiful. It's fir. It's just a lovely floor and very durable. And this is another photo of what we have now. We really tried to open up the volume. Unfortunately, when you start complying with modern expectations for dining and light, we have a lot more things going on. You know, luckily we've got colors returned. We've got retro furniture is so easy to get these days. If we'd done this project 15 years ago, it would have been a lot harder, but our interior designers just had a field day with this because there's a lot more available now. But the whole idea is that you still have the neutral background, and the color and the kind of pizzazz, the bling, is in those movable things that ideally don't detract from the basic volume and neutral background. And this is what the lounge looked like in 1957. And this is what I was referring to as this sort of fireplace kind of feel, and it has this great sunburst clock, the colors on the light fixtures. This is the gift shop, and you can see it's fairly translucent. And look at all that light coming through. They actually had a plethora of light, almost too much. They ended up having curtains, and they had curtains on both the east and west sides. And the colors were really meant to reflect what was in the canyon. So you have yellows and oranges that reflect the wonderful cliffs around the canyon near the falls, and dark greens and browns to represent the forested areas of the mountains and cliffs by them. And this is what we have in 2015. Now, in 1960, they introduced a stairway here, an internal stairway down into the area where those convention rooms were. So that was like one step removed from this sort of fireplace feel in terms of, you know, how this might feel in terms of being a little homier. So this is what we started with, and this is what we have now. This is where you can get beer and wine. And beyond that is ice cream. Apparently, everyone has to have their ice cream. We were able to restore the wood block flooring that was still there underneath the carpeting, and found the original supplier. It's great. 1950s, we actually had specifications from this time, and were able to call some of the suppliers to see if they were still around. I do remember having an interesting phone call with a firm in New York that was doing promotional filming for the Park Service, because I was hoping they might have a film about this project, because all the records talk about we need to document this and show this, because we want to use this as an example to show how to do the design, how to do the construction, and how everybody is supposed to work with each other. Park Service, landscape architect within the park, and the regional Park Service people, and the designer and the contractor, how it all works, the best way. And so this film was going to show that sequence. So I called this firm, and they did a lot of films back then. They don't know if they did that one. He was going to check his archives. I've called this guy like every 4 months now and still don't have anything. And he may not have it, but I would love to be able to see how they would have promoted that. But so we tried to work within the vein of the style that we have here, and yet Xanterra is in a position where they need to get busloads, huge busloads of people in and out of this building in an hour. They deal with like 5,000 people a day, and they have to get more and faster meals out there. So that was all part of this drive for the renovation. And here we are back at my bar, my favorite bar. So I told you that it was relocated and it was truncated, and this is what it was. In 1964, this is where they relocated it. They shrunk it down by about 5 feet. I don't know what happened to the plywood. We always thought it might be underneath this very thin veneer of kind of countrified pine and this Contiki-ized thing. Oh, Lord. But it's the original bar, and it has this wonderful kind of shape to it. And actually, going back to it, you can't quite see it, but the column interferes, engages, intersects that the bar top, and there's actually a little scar in the formica on the bar from where that column used to be when they relocated it. It would have, the column would have been here, but of course, there's no column here. There's no need for it structurally. So this is what we have now. we took, this is the original bar, and this is where it had been truncated to. We were able to extend it to nearly its original length and take advantage of that inherited condition to provide ADA seating at the bar. And we used what are called three-form. These are plastic panels where we were able to have a screen they're 3/4 inch thick. This is a back bar. Those are actually doors. And so this pattern is in between these two translucent panels. And so when it's backlit, you can get a really nice glowing feel of that. And this is not located in the same place. This is down at the south end of the building. We were dealing with, new program of where they needed various dining and other activities to be. So at least we have it. We're thrilled to have it. And apparently that's where I stopped. Because I told Patty when I first walked in today, because she relayed a wonderful experience she had at Canyon Village Lodge, and I still want to be there in the evening for a drink at that bar. I just think that, it is surrounded still by trees. You do still get us, and they're far more mature than they were at the time of its original construction. I like to think that people are really appreciating Mission 66 more now when they see things like this. We knew we would be catering to a younger crowd as well as older crowds. So we're hoping we were bridging the gap there, that people would remember. We've had a lot of people go through who remember going through there in the 50s. And we also have new, the younger crowd loves this retro stuff. So we're hoping that we can kind of bridge that gap and have it be something that people will appreciate and take to their next national park. Because these are resources now that are in peril. Thank you.